So you can share it?
Is my speech?
Yeah, your screen. So do you have slides?
No, I don't have anything, so I will...
Okay, then speak, then talk, just talk.
The slides don't work, they don't scroll. The slides from Eve didn't work, didn't scroll.
They did not scroll. So there's a problem with the slides. We have to see how that goes. But you have slides? No, you don't have. Okay. So I have to introduce to you first Yves, Jean François now. Let's see where I have the stuff. So Jean François Braunstein, he's a philosopher he's working at the Sorbonne, Paris. He's now retired emeritus, and he did his studies in Provence, Aix-Marseille University. Then afterwards he obtained a degree in philosophy. And in the Sorbonne, he did in 1977 his DEA in philosophy and then his thesis. And he has been working in the field of medicine and philosophy, in both areas. And he is a very outspoken person, very critique. In terms of so what we see now with the current movements of social justice, and he wrote several books about it. And I think in the afternoon he will get even a book prize, right? You will get awarded for your books then. And I think we have now a little bit how do you say, summary of his work and what he's doing in this field. So the floor is yours, Jean François.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Pierre, for your invitation. I'm really sorry not to be able to be in person with you today. I know Andreas for 2 years through our own struggles. The title that Andreas suggested, and which I gladly accepted, is its idea of a general obsession, stems from the fact that I have two observations. It is the feature of the French university system, that the history of science is most often taught in philosophy departments like mine at the Sorbonne. And therefore, on the dualization of the situation, both in the humanities faculties and in the field of epistemology and the history of science, which is my academic specialty. As far as humanities faculties are concerned, it seems to me that the domination of what I chose in a recent book called Religion is now almost total in fact. I like first to make it clear from the outset that I will use this term not because I'm extreme right-wing or the Trumpist, quite the contrary, but because these terms seems to be perfectly suited for describing the religious enthusiasm and intolerance that characterize the proponents of these theories.
Jean-François, est-ce que tu peux monter un peu le son, s'il te plaît? Si possible.
L'ajuste au maximum. Je me rapprocher un peu de l'ordinateur.
Non, c'est bon.
We have to. We need to increase that.
On t'entend, mais il faut tirer l'oreille pour les yeux.
In philosophy, the vast majority of teachers
teachings, colloquia, cultural study. Ça va mieux?
Oui.
Now focus on gender, race, intersectionality, and decoloniality. Here are just a few examples of recent colloquia. Women as philosopher, demasculinizing social science and humanities, decolonizing scientific research in the humanities, degendering mathematics, and so on. Classical philosophy is reinterpreted from this point of view. Phenomenology is now transformed into political phenomenology or liberation phenomenology, and Wittgenstein is curiously studied from the point of view of his feminist uses. It seems to me that this movement is irreversible, at least in the short term. PhD students who wish to engage in non-conforming research are systematically discouraged. Students are not fooled. Those who do not adhere to these ideas choose other studies in fields they hope to be not affected: law, business, medicine, sciences. But it's not certain that this is a long-term solution. Indeed, it's clear that the woke offensive is now moving directly into the hard sciences and medicine. I'd like to try to explain briefly in my presentation why this offensive is entirely current from the woke point of view. In my opinion, it is possible to summarize the woke doctrines around 4 theories outlined in my book. First, the 3 most popular: gender theory, critical race theory, and intersectional theory. But we shouldn't omit the philosophy of knowledge thesis, that is the standpoint epistemology. This is undoubtedly the most destructive part of the woke belief, even if it's often overlooked. As far as science is concerned, it seems to me that the 2 main theories at issue are gender theory and standpoint epistemology. So I will talk of these 2 theories. First, the gender theory versus biology and transactivism versus medicine. Gender theory seems essential in woke thinking insofar as it is the oldest but also the most innovative and radical of the 4 theories. But it is also the one with the most direct consequences in the scientific field. By denying the basic truths of biology, it demands that we adhere to ideas that are patently false, as we all have noted. For gender theories, the idea that there are 2 sexes in the human species and that reproduction is gender is an unacceptable proposition linked only to very least prejudice. For stating these simple facts in a newspaper, I was denounced as a transphobe at the Sorbonne, in a quite known paper. According to Anne Sterling, biology is a political discipline through and through, described as patriarchal, imperialist, or for good measure, colonialist, according to Donna Haraway. In France, a trendy philosopher of science makes an even more radical diagnosis. Biology, I make a quotation, biology biases us, patriarchal, it has wallowed in androcentrism and heterosexism, 2 diseases from which it must be cured, otherwise it condemns itself to be wrong when it speaks of women. It is merely a political device against which we must defend those whom the biology of sex has helped to oppress: women, homosexuals, transsexual, intersex people. According to this philosopher, we therefore urgently need to lay the foundations for another non-sexist biology. The idea that there is a bad science, imperialist biology, and that we need to build a good science against traditional biology obviously evokes memories of Lysenkoism. During this catastrophic episode of the Stalinist era, which lasted from the 1930s to the 1960s, The agronomists profusely said, claim to have developed a technique for transforming winter wheat into spring wheat and concluded that the existence of genes
Recording in progress.
and chromosomes should be called into question. His target was the genetics of the monk Mendel, which was to be condemned as bourgeois because it was linked to the randomness of mutations. Lysenko's theory, which revived the old American theory of the heredity of acquired traits, was much more in tune with the projects to build a new man and with Stalin's fevered Prometheism, for whom there was no limit to man's transformation of nature. This doctrine of the two sciences, bourgeois science and proletarian science, was supported by the entire state apparatus of the Soviet dictatorship, and competent biologists who understood that genetics was a real science were hunted down, imprisoned, or shot. This episode has the lasting impact on Soviet biology. Today, there are no prison camps for dissident biologists, but it's still possible not to find a university position or to be expelled from one's university simply for having the courage to write that there are biological differences between men and women, as numerous examples, you all know them, prove this fact. This memory of Lysenko's no doubt explains why the academics most concerned by the woke offensive in the sciences are often refugees from communist countries who know what happens when science is politicized. And yet, an eminent French philosopher of science wrote a few days ago and had no hesitation in advocating that politics should from now on occupy more space in science and preaching for a political turn in science that should be inspired by the feminist epistemologies we'll be talking about shortly. In the field of medicine, too, gender theory has extremely serious consequences, as we all know. Despite Hilary Cass' report on this issue, a number of doctors persist in endorsing the trans-affirmative movement and prescribing medical treatments for children and adolescents who feel they are in the wrong body. I won't insist on it today, but it's all about affirming that consciousness takes precedence over the body in a movement reminiscent of the old Gnostic heresies and their contempt for the body and the world as evil. But this trans-activist movement is also in line with the transhumanist desire to modify the body, which is no more than meat, while waiting to free ourselves from this body and download our consciousnesses into silicon chips. We're dealing here with an emancipation movement gone mad, which aims to set us free from what is most inescapable for us, our body, while waiting to free ourselves from death. The result is a radical solipsism. Only consciousness exists, free to choose their own sexes and bodies. This probably explains why some doctors collaborate in this trans movement in a pathetic effort to be at the forefront of emancipation, i.e., the overcoming of necessity by will, of nature by culture. The worst thing is that the wokes, emboldened by this attack on biology, will not hesitate to attack other sciences too, on the pretext that they are virilist or racist or both. This will even be the case for the purest of all science, mathematics. From this point of view, we are witnessing an unparalleled attack in the history of science, a deliberate assault on mathematics led by a few mathematicians. Never before has the hatred of reason gone so far. You're, of course, familiar with Sergiu Kleinerman's work on this issue, who notes that in Romania, under Ceausescu's dictatorship, at least mathematics was left in peace.
Second moment of my talk, I will talk of the epistemological with many quotation marks. The epistemological basis of this criticism, and first the critique of objectivity. For these activists, science is always done by dominant white men who are the vast majority of scientists. The two essential scientific notions of objectivity and rationality are said to be linked to virilism, racism, and colonialism. Women theorists of gender, but also of race, first set out to refute the idea of objectivity. For instance, jurist Anne Scales, inspired by feminist Catherine McKinnon, rejects what she calls the tyranny of objectivity. She regrets having been trained in a legal discipline that provides abstract, universal, and objective solutions to social ills in the form of legal rules or doctrines. In her view, the idea of objectivity exerts a narcotic influence on our minds and makes us less and less attentive to the mythical structures that surround us. Objectivity is merely a patriarchal myth, a projection of the male psyche. The sciences are not the work of a supposedly universal man, they are merely the work of male scientists. They are masculine, not neutral. Against this supposed objectivity, this jurist claims an assumed subjectivity to elaborate a feminine knowledge. For a wider audience and from the point of view of race, Ibrahim X. Kendi, well known and well criticized today, explained that he had a real revelation when he learned from an African American academic that objectivity was in fact collective subjectivity. And so he says it is therefore impossible to be objective. All knowledge is subjective, even if it may be collective subjectivity. There is no world independent of our point of view. Another well-known publicist, Robin DiAngelo, goes in the same direction. The belief in objectivity allows white people to see themselves as universal humans who can represent all human experience. They want to believe that white people are just people. No, says Robin DiAngelo, they are not people, they are white people, and the point of view of the racialized must be set against them. Donc, we have no possibility of objectivity. Critique of rationality, I will take another example with a recent American woman philosopher, Sally Haslanger. For her, feminist research puts an end to the notion of rationality. For Haslanger, one of the common themes of feminist research over the past decade has been the claim that reason is gendered, or more accurately, male or masculine. Feminist theory should therefore avoid investing in rationality, at least as traditionally conceived. It is not enough to balance the value of reason with feminine values, but to question our commitments to rational ideas. At least things are said very clearly. She has a huge influence in philosophy department. This has a whole series of very radical consequences. Again, according to Haslanger, we should avoid an epistemology that privileges reason or the point of view of reason. We should avoid theories of the self that regard rationality as a characteristic trait. And we should avoid endorsing moral and political ideals that glorify reason and the reasonable person, read man. So the critique is very radical against epistemology founded on reason, against theories of the self who trust in rationality, against the ideal, political ideals that glorify reasonable man. For this critique of science, there is a great woke invention. They are very happy of their invention, that is standpoint epistemology. All of you know this epistemology. It was first viewed by a seminal article from 1988 from Donna Haraway, author of the Cyborg Manifesto. She had already put forward the idea of developing situated knowledge. She said, I would like a doctrine of embedded objectivity that welcomes paradoxical and critical feminist projects on science. Feminist objectivity then simply meaning situated knowledge. For Haraway, the supposedly neutral idea of a view from nowhere must be radically rejected. To believe that it would be possible to have such an infinite vision is an illusion, a god trick. It is militarism, capitalism, colonialism, and male supremacy that support the idea of a gaze unmarked by gender, race, class, and so on. For Haraway, things are clear. I militate for the politics and epistemologies of location, positioning, and situation where partiality, not universality, is the condition for asserting one's claims to the construction of rational knowledge. In a famous article published in 1992, Rethinking Standpoint Epistemology, What is Strong Objectivity?, Sandra Harding also explains that societies are constituted by power relations, and in science too, there are dominants and dominated. The starting point of Harding's standpoint theory is that in societies, hierarchisé in French by race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, or other such politics that profoundly shape the structure of societies, the activities of those at the top both organize and set limits on what they can understand about themselves and the world around them. Science's point of view from nowhere and universalist claims reflect this domination and would not allow us to understand human relations and the world. On the other hand, the activities of those at the bottom of such social hierarchies provide starting points for thought. For Harding, standpoint epistemology must therefore address the question of the relationship between science and politics. We need to understand the effects that different kinds of politics have on the production of knowledge. We can therefore envisage the production of sciences that are deliberately identitarian. There will be as many distinct sciences as there are marginalized groups with this or that viewpoint, and no attempt should be made to unify them. It is by assuming this political viewpoint that we'll achieve true objectivity. We'll make better science by appealing to the viewpoint of the dominated. We'll then have a more complete picture of reality. Everyone has a say in the constitution of knowledge, and Harding naturally praises popular or indigenous knowledge, which has so far been too neglected. And Harding makes it clear that this applies not only to the humanities, but also to the seemingly most abstract sciences such as mathematics and logic. Sandra Harding's stroke of genius was to call this committed knowledge strong objectivity, even though it is precisely this knowledge that prides itself on its subjectivity and partiality and declares its unwillingness to depart from them. In fact, strong objectivity is an unabashed rejection of the ideal of objectivity and the preeminence given to identitarian sciences. A contradictory expression, if ever there was one. But the ever magical nature of woke thinking means that simply using the formula of strong objectivity is enough to answer the accusations of relativism that such claims obviously entail. The existence of bias and their interpretation The starting point for these standpoint epistemologies are trivial considerations in the philosophy of science, ever since there has been a sociology of science. Yves Gingras thought from that. Certainly, scientists live in a social milieu, and their research is in some sense dependent of this milieu, if only through the language they use, which is derived from the common language. Ludwig Flegg noted this as early as the 1930s in his book Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, who had a huge influence on Kuhn. But if it's one thing to recognize that knowledge always presupposes conditions, a context, it's quite another to welcome this and refuse to aim for an objective point of view that transcends this historical starting point. Scientists have long been aware of the fact that social or technical conditions, and even in certain cases political or personal ones, can interfere with their knowledge. But the very principle of scientific research is to try to get rid of this social imprint as far as possible, to minimize it rather than to indulge it with relish. In so doing, they will strive to approach a more exact knowledge of the world, as Bachelard showed in his essay on approximate knowledge. Of course, there are historical conditions for the emergence of truth, and there is undoubtedly a certain history of truth, but it does not mean that there is not a truth that is given in the unfolding history of science itself. Science aims to establish a truth that gives a more accurate account of the world it studies. As Bachelard puts it, the history of science is not an history like any other. It is essentially a judged history, judged in the detail of its wave, with a sense of truth that must be constantly refined. Truth may well have a history, but that doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist. Lastly, I will talk about this question of the epistemic injustice, and which is aimed against truth. For Walks, on the other hand, it's not a question of improving science, but of destroying its foundation. We see this, for example, with another fashionable notion, that of epistemic injustice, coined by Miranda Fricker. The history of science is said to be full of these epistemic injustices, which consist in diminishing the knowledge value of certain testimonies for reasons essentially linked to the social position of the bearer of that testimony, such as gender or ethnic identity. This would be a kind of diminution of credibility for the victim. The first priority would therefore be to denounce this injustice. As a pro-gender sociologist, French pro-gender sociologist notes, it has been an activity of feminist researchers from the outset to decipher the androcentrism of the works that formed them and those of their contemporaries, passionately reminding us that there is always someone missing from the picture. To remedy this, we need to give a voice to the victims of epistemic injustice, the only ones in a position to bear witness to their situation as women, black, racialized, and so on. These victims are also the only ones in a position to interpret the testimonies they provide and to found new science in relation to their identity. This implies, for example, that only women can speak out on the cause of women or black on that of racialized people. Knowledge would no longer aspire to be neutral, and this would be the end of the very idea of universalism. Each person would only be able to testify to his or her own point of view with no possibility of expansion. From this idea also stems a project of a science that would no longer appeal to scientists alone, but to the public, or more precisely to a public tutored by experts. The need to which, I quote a French epistemologist, the needs to which scientific inquiry must respond are those defined at the end of a deliberative process between citizens educated, tutored by experts. This opens the door to socially responsible science and so-called citizens' conferences on various scientific issues, which make all manner of technocratic or political manipulation possible. As computer scientist and philosopher Jean-Gabriel Ganassia points out, until now, scientific knowledge was essential because all rational beings, whatever their origins, had to be able to repeat demonstrations indefinitely in order to verify their rigor and make their own observations. If reasoning and its empirical validation depend on the origin of the author, we can no longer see how to found a science, let alone share knowledge. In this, epistemic injustice contradicts all the principles of all epistemology. For this reason, feminist epistemology and all standpoint epistemology cannot present themselves as philosophy of science. As epistemologist Cassandra Pinnick rightly points out, feminist epistemology is not to be taken seriously insofar as it yields to the well-known paradox of saying that truth does not exist and contradicts itself by this very assertion. The most outspoken of these standpoint epistemologies simply admit that they are not interested in truth, but only in the point of view of the dominated, and so choose to leave science. Two of these new style epistemologists, French and Swiss, believe that according to standpoint epistemology, it's not a question of asserting that a subaltern point of view is intrinsically the bearer of truer knowledge, but rather of insisting on the need to produce a capacity for collective analysis that takes the point of view of the dominated and thus give a large share of their experience. For the wogs, all truth is partial, biased, committed, and militant. So no more truth, but of the dominant and the dominated. It couldn't be clearer. It's consistent that these two epistemologies I just quoted clearly point to their adversary, the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Whereas the epistemology of science, inherited from the Enlightenment, presupposes the possibility of objective knowledge, enunciated by an impartial observer, detached from the reality of the world, standpoint epistemologies asserts that such an observer does not exist because the subject who produces knowledge is immersed in the social world. Feminist philosophers of science therefore criticize the assertion that the scholarly subject can be value-free and merely a disembodied expression of reality. So, to conclude, it's logical to see that a few pages later, the same feminist epistemologists should go on to praise witches, as is customary in the contemporary academic world. We should welcome the political revival of the figure of the witch, so dear to a spiritual ecofeminist. These witches will be the Newtons and Marie Curies of the woke academics. But I find it difficult to present oneself as an epistemologist and a witch at the same time. It's doubtful that witches can keep our world running. So I think it makes little sense to argue with militants who refuse to argue with true believers. Scientists and society as a whole need to realize that this is a deliberate attempt to destroy science, which must be resisted. It is in science that the takeover by the woke would have its most deleterious effect, and it is perhaps still possible to resist this enterprise. We are here for this objective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean François, for this very clear statement against the woke ideology. So are there any questions? Yes, Jacques?
Yes, just a reflection. I think that if only philosophers or epistemologists were destroying science, that would not be so serious. But when biologists themselves want to destroy science, I heard a webinar of the French Cancer Society where a young scientist in Institut Pasteur, a leader of a group, a principal investigator of a group, said that she had been shocked when she was in high school to learn that ovum, ovula, was a big cell, large cell, immobile and passive, whereas spermatozoids were mobile, active, and so on, and small. And so everybody in the audience said, oh, that's true. Oh, yeah, that's shocking. And when I said this is completely stupid, you have to buy a microscope, maybe, to see what is an ovum and what is a spermatozoid. Maybe you never saw. I've been treated as if I had destroyed a dogma. And when biologists and Institut Pasteur biologists tell such nonsense, what can be done?
Yes, it's a really, really good question, because I had the same example from a young scholar, you know, he was at a colloquium and there was a talk saying sex, it's only cultural. It was a history of biology colloquium, and the girl said sex, it's only culture and so on. And there was a discussion, nobody said anything, and this young, courageous scholar said, sorry, sex is biological, and there can be cultural influences on the body and so on, but there are two sexes, and it's a basis of biology. And nobody said something, and at the end of the day, many people, they told me that, came and said, oh, bravo, thank you, you said what I thought, but I couldn't say that, and so on. And I think what is most frightening is this absence of courage. What are these people, especially in France? You don't risk anything. You lose all your friends, like I did, but you can be fired from the university. But I think it's the question of the male, which is active and so on. And perhaps there are a few, you have to, like you say, look through a microscope, and so you see what's happening. And perhaps there could be a few bad chosen words, but it's a basis of biology. I think, in my view, if these stupid ideas work so well, that's because there is no more good teaching of biology in secondary schools. There is no idea of the history of science, and I don't know how to, you're right, because if biologists don't say anything, there are a few that we will hear a few of them today, but I think it's a question of courage. But for the more convinced of these scholars, I think that's why I talk of religion woke. I think it's impossible to discuss with them. It's like a belief. It's like the belief studied in the famous book, When the Prophecy Fails. The people who are waiting for the end of the world, and two sociologists went there, and they see that when the world doesn't cease on the 5th of December, so they invent a new hypothesis to have their belief still working. So I think it's when I speak to that, I think for our problem, we have to talk to the politicians. And so I'm quite happy that my book has a certain echo, because I think when you explain to politicians that there are teachings in medicine courses where the teachers say person with an uterus, person who are pregnant instead of men and women, something has to be done.
Yeah, Jean François, there's even, for instance, journals, Elsevier, Springer Nature, who now recommends thought reform and language reform. Okay, for instance, for a parent or for a father, mother, you have used now caregiver. Okay, so that's that's a little bit that's really strange.
Yes, but the director of the Lancet of the Natures are completely acquired to this new ideology. The director, I think, of Lancet said, now we have to speak of, you have to make political articles in our paper. So I think perhaps we have to find other papers. It will be very difficult, but there was a cover of the Lancet speaking of the how do they say, instead of women, they said bodies with a vagina instead of women. Bodies with vagina has been very mistreated. You have a medical paper with such ridiculous title, with such ridiculous cover, so you have to change to be very aware that this journal is not only a scientific journal, it's quite evidently a political journal. They say it. I don't know what is the name of this. The director of the Lancet.
Alton,
Yeah.
Richard Alton.
Is completely is a work in the is one of the purest work I've ever met, I've ever read. So
Okay, so the final question.
Yes, I think I have three aspects I want to go through. The first one is that I agree on one thing about the education. What I mean by that is that I think the accessibility of science is something that we need to work on, and that that's something that was not said during the first presentation, but that's quite linked to... Yes, do you hear me better now? Okay, I was talking about the accessibility of science because during the first presentation we saw that some papers were misunderstood by the public and then used wrongly even though their conclusions were valid. So maybe we have to put an effort in education so that the papers should not be retracted but rather be understood by a larger public. So I think it's one thing, the accessibility of science, that we should work on, and that maybe you're talking about the biology, so it works for these two. My second thought was that I think that most, you cannot say that nothing is political, because when you are doing your research papers and you find your subjects to research, they are always based on what the society needs at the moment. So for example, if a war is coming, then we will research more on weapons. So it's normal, and I think these kinds of research you're talking about, it's just another way of the society evolves, and we will soon find a compromise, a more nuanced balance between all of that. And third, I had a question about the mathematics. During your presentations, you talked about how the woke movement aims to change the mathematics, but I'm not aware of that. Could you please elaborate on the example, please?
I didn't hear everything. I think there was a problem with the mic. About the question, the second question of the political, I think we should never make politics in the science. And this question from a colleague now saying epistemology must be more political. No, epistemology must try to avoid to be political. But when I said at the end that perhaps the solution would be a political one, I think as citizens, as academics, we should try to tell our governance or institution that there is a problem now happening in the science science universities. So I've been heard by an academy of the medicine. I told them what is taught under science, medicine, medical humanities, medicine and philosophy, medicine, science and society, and so on. It's all woke ideology made by philosophers who have no other place to go and who have a political agenda. So I think this question of the politics is important because I think in the humanities department, it's too late. I'm quite pessimistic, but in France now, everyone in these departments is okay, except a few ones, and we are almost all today on this colloquium.
So if now the final question by you.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer this question about the politics. I think it's very important to understand that it is perfectly true there is politics.
Si vous pouvez parler plus fort, ou mettre le micro plus fort, j'entends quasiment rien là.
It is perfectly true that there is politics in science, but the answer to that is the old distinction by Hans Reichenbach in 1931 about the context of discovery, which is where social invest more in medicine, health, or physics, or chemistry, or not at all, and the context of justification. So there's no problem. You can decide to work on water, but the military want to know if it works.
Okay, if it doesn't work, it's the context of justification. So there's no problem. The problem, those who we need more politics in science. We can answer, what do you mean? If you mean we have more research on women's disease, that's a social choice. But if the results of the research on women's disease is true or not, it will be decided by the community retesting the thing. And so I see absolutely no problem there between the role of politics in society and what we call science. I think we have to remember that what we call science is validated knowledge through the community and the context of justification. We justify through logic, through experimentation, through mathematics. We have ways to justify knowledge, but we cannot say there shouldn't be politics in science because this sentence is vague. We have to distinguish the social context of investing in a given domain, and it's changed. I told you the case of women history. There's a lot of work on women history. It's very good. There was none in 1940. This is the context of research. But the validity is something else. There can be ideology in it, or there can be more objective research based on documents. So I think it's important to distinguish that.
Yes, it's true. We have to always remember this distinction between the context of discovery and context of justification. But for these woke people, they only talk of the context of discovery. So it's true that there were not so many women practicing science at the time. The research on syphilis was made for social reasons and so on. I quoted the flag, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, which is a beautiful study of this context of discovery of syphilis, and it talks about philosophy, it talks about politics, it talks about medical specialties, but it doesn't take the conclusion that there is no context of justification, and it tries to find real solid basis for this true. For syphilis is not so evident, but in other cases it's very evident. And so it doesn't mean that we don't have to study even the love affairs of Marie Curie, even if it's not so important for me, but it doesn't take anything from the truths that Marie Curie contributed to to discover. And so you're completely right. I think the idea of context of justification has completely disappeared because there is no more community of scientists. When you say, and when we think that something must be retested by the other members of the scientific community, there is no more scientific community for them. There is only dominance and dominated, women, trans, and so on. That's a huge attack on the universality of science, and that's why I'm why I wrote a few books and I lose time reading these things, but I think they are not kidding. It's just, they really believe in that. That's
Okay.
seeing biologists say human species is not, there are no two sexes in the human species. It's incredible for me. But I think it's tied to religious beliefs, sort of
Okay.
religious.
Okay, Jean-François, so I think we have to end now. Thank you
Yes.
very much
Thank
for
you.
your presentation. So you should have been with us because we had a nice evening yesterday, and we will have a nice evening this evening also. Okay, so thank you very much, Jean-François.